Happy to be here again today with Mark Lefevre, and we're going to be talking again. We're going to be on the tracking. We're going to be tracking the psychedelic conversation. There's the word. And I'm going to let Mark start because Mark, you've got kind of an introductory paragraph, and then we can take off from there.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So I think we're going to be tracking the beast of wisdom, to use some of the terminology that Peterson and Vervaeke came up with. And so what I did was, we sort of teased about, you said 20 minutes. Paul Vanderklay said, well, a lot of people dropped out at 20 minutes. And I was like, what did I miss? It never occurred to me that the first 20 minutes or so were different from the rest of the talk. So I did listen and take even more notes. Which I was telling you earlier, right? It ended up being a transcription practically. There was nothing to compress. And I think that's a deep part of the problem. So, and then I took some other notes, I took the interspersed notes, but I also took some overview notes. So, and I wanted to start with something that my good friend Manuel said, and I'm going to paraphrase him as best I can. He's such a concise speaker. You can't paraphrase him either. These people and their concise speech, it's terrible. So he said the talk was better than he hoped, and he wasn't really expecting John to do that well, which I found fascinating. I'm not sure I agree with Manuel. I'm just reporting what he said, right? And he said likely thanks to Peterson because of the way he treated John. And I was like, that's an interesting perspective. Whether you agree or not. And John was there to kind of showcase his work and expound upon it, right? But as we said before, like that's not what Peterson really needed and was really looking for. And so, it's sort of interesting how dense this is. There's no wasted words, right? There's a little bit of fumbling, which, okay, I do that all the time when I talk. It's kind of what talking is, right? And there was some restatement, but there was no time to catch up with it. So like I can usually transcribe and compress pretty well, but with this, I couldn't do it. There was just not enough compression stuff. I kept having to stop the video and catch up to what they were saying. And I
noticed when I was trying to do a transcription also, and I noticed that what would happen is I would transcribe and he would be on to another thought. And then I would realize, wait a minute, there was one word in between this and that thought. And I missed that word, and I'd have to go back, and that word would be like key.
Well, I'm glad you had exactly the same experience I had. Yeah. I feel a little not dumb now.
Yeah.
I was feeling like, did I lose my transcription skills? Is it finally over for me? Should I just call it a day? Right.
Well, it never occurred to me. I could have slowed it down to like 2, couldn't I? I mean, or half or something. Right. And I didn't do that. I should have done that. That would have made it easier.
Yeah. And I think one of the problems with this talk was it sort of seemed to start out so slow. And like my first note for the first 2 minutes is boring intro, right? It's all boring stuff. John's going to talk about all his work, which I already know, right? Because to me, it's boring because I track him pretty well. I don't listen to everything by any means because he put out a bunch of stuff during COVID. But it's they jump right in, right? They jump in almost immediately, and you have very little time as an audience to adjust to that change. That change happens so fast. And I mean, they do kind of announce it during kind of, well, let's just jump into it, right? It's like, oh, okay. But then they're so deep in, and there's a change in attitude and tempo, not just the depth of what they're talking about, because they go from introduction, John, introduce your work, to wait a minute, what about thought? I was like, huh? What thought? Wait, like we were introducing his work. Like, let's finish that. And,
well,
and there was finish.
So I don't know whether you want to, if you want to get through this whole intro thing first and then go back to the beginning, or if this intro is where we start in, because there's one thing I want to put a pin in at the very first thing they said, because I think it's going to be important later on. When John first begins describing his project, the first thing he says is he's been working on untangling the world's knot. And that I want to put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that later.
Yeah, that's he's got a series called Untangling the World Knot of Consciousness.
He does. Okay.
With Greg Enriques.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that.
That's the hard problem of consciousness. And I watched about half of it and quite frankly got bored. But but it's a joy to watch, not just for John, but Greg Enriques is awesome. He's great. We had him on our AFTMC Discord server for a Q&A. He was he's just a great guy. He's really
Well,
fun.
I just think it's an interesting phrase in light of what they start talking about later on. So, yeah.
Right. Well, and he mentions untangling the world not in this talk, although I don't know if it's in the first 30 minutes, because even though I did it yesterday, I haven't disentangled the talk. But that's the other thing about the talk, right? The talk's very difficult to disentangle because they do keep going back to the same core questions. And I'm not sure I know all the core questions. I've been writing them down separately as I found them. Oh, Jordan asked this question. That's one of his core questions. That's one of his core axioms, his core questions. Let's shove that in a separate section of the document. I'm like, it's really hard to take notes for this, right? And then, so I think that even if you're familiar, like, the fact that the change happens so fast, you miss the fact that in order for something to go that deep, that quickly, they both have to be familiar with each other's work. It's not, you can't, like, I couldn't go up to a postmodernist and get deep into his work right away. I don't know anything about postmodernism at that level, right? I just know sort of like the top level results and where it's all going, right? Because you can see that unfold. If Jordan Peterson's thesis is correct, which again, I think it is, but then it's like, oh, okay. But again, they've had a similar discussion, right? And then, the whole thing about the interruptions is not really the key to why people are uncomfortable with this conversation. The thing that I noticed that a lot of people probably won't pick up on is that John does mention this at the 15-minute mark. He mentions his social anxiety, and he mentions it very quickly. But I've talked to John many times, and he comes on our Discord server and does Q&A. Right now it's once a month. It used to be twice a month. I've had private conversations with him before, and someone in other forums, right, in other sort of limited forums, and quite a bit of interaction with him when he was doing his meditation series. So he did a live meditation on YouTube, right? That's sort of how the Discord server started, right? Was in the middle of that. And we all jumped from the YouTube live stream over to the Discord. And that's where we do our after meditation talk with each other. And we still do that, by the way, every day, every morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time. 9:30 Eastern time, except Saturdays, where we do it 9 Eastern. And John mentioned in the meditation quite a few times, and you saw it when he was doing the meditation, because part of the meditation, he did a Cultivating Wisdom course. So all these things are on YouTube. And he talks about his social anxiety, and you see it. And the way it manifests is this nervous laughter. And I was like, oh, he's doing his nervous, to me, oh yeah, it's just John doing his nervous laughter thing. But if you don't know that about him, I can totally see, we'd be like, oh, he's uncomfortable. And it's like, well, yeah, he's uncomfortable in the way he's expressing this, but he's not uncomfortable with Jordan. He's just caught off guard. When he's caught off guard, he does this, it's very high pitched. It's this sort of high pitched, awkward laugh, and it doesn't quite fit. And that's part of his social anxiety. But if you don't know that, I can totally understand now. Oh, because he does it all throughout the first, 30 minutes pretty much. And I think he does it a few other times in the talk, but it does calm down at a certain point, and the laughter becomes more natural. I forget, around 23 minutes, everything changes. And I think the other thing is that Peterson's going from 90 miles per hour to 0 at some point. Like he's going like, John, and he's dragging John into the frame that he wants to talk about. Yeah, and the question, back to the question, John, back into the frame that I'm putting it in, because I need to understand it from my perspective. Fair enough. It's his channel. It's his talk, right? And John obliges. Good. That's great. Like, that's what Dialogos is, right? And then John will drop the hammer and answer the question in the way that makes Jordan understand. And Jordan just stops. And at one point he's doing this, right? It's like, whoa, what was that about, right? Well, that was about him having the realization. And so it's very hard for people to navigate that changing tempo. And that very much happens here until they get into this flow. And then the tone changes, the temper changes, and then the two friends adjust to one another and both loosen up visibly and in their speech patterns. And everything slows down and it becomes regular. They really kind of settle into each other and they get familiar, and it becomes sort of a loving, playful thing. And this is right around the time that Jordan cracks the joke about the t-shirt, which everybody seems to be like, the t-shirt thing. Wow, this is proof that he was on mushrooms in his vein. I'm like, what? He just made a funny comment that John laughed at. Like, they both thought it was hysterical. And I have notes on that. If we get that far in this video, I'm happy to go into. But yeah, let's just jump into the, like I said, I skipped the first 2 minutes of boring intro, but I don't know what you want to cover from there.
Well, this is, I think, maybe starting about minute 3 or something. George is talking, John is talking about his core project, understanding more deeply the process of dialogue and what it does in terms of distributed cognition. And Jordan says, what is the difference between dialogue and thought? And then he sort of, is it a dialogue? Is it a trialogue? Is it a quadrilogue? And John didn't seem to pick up on that part of the question, which I thought was kind of interesting because I mean, I think, well, go ahead, you say what you think.
So I think just before that though, Karen, there was an interesting thing. So at the 2-minute mark, about, according to my notes, Peterson says, meaning is what we're going to talk about, which I thought was first of all, like, again, John has a science of meaning, if you ask me. Maybe he doesn't think of it that way. That's the way I think of it. So that's like a whopper of a conversation. We're going to be right in your camp, John, right in your camp. And then last, we talked about meaning in life. I think it was 6 years ago is what he said. Whether it was 5 or 6 or 7, I don't know. But that's roughly what he said. So I thought that was interesting because I'm not sure that Jordan got back to that. But to your point, yeah, the first interruption at roughly 3 minutes and 28 seconds, John didn't get to finish, sure, but they agreed to continue. And what John capitulated to Jordan, yeah, he didn't get into details about dialogue, trialogue, etc. But he did say, explaining thought in cog-sci terms seems to indicate that it might be more dialogical than we realized, which indicates it could be dialogical, trilogical, right? But I'm not willing to commit. But I am willing to commit, from my perspective, John said, I am willing to commit that the cog-sci backs you up. And that seemed to really put Jordan at ease. Like, oh, good, like the cog-sci is there. Because he does that a number of times. He's like, oh, good, the cog-sci agrees with me. So I thought that came out right there. That's at like 3 minutes and 28 seconds.
But what do you think was the meaning of Jordan's question, that it's dialogical, trialogical, or quadrilogical?
He gets into that, and I'll point it out when we get there.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think there's even more to it than what he gets into later on, but okay.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. That's very deep. But I think they're being cautious because they're academics, right? We're not academics. We can be sloppy.
Yes. Okay. So then John Vervaeke says, not a treatise, but perhaps more dialogical. Even reason may be dialogical. And he said that idea is becoming mainstream. And for some reason that struck me so funny. It's like, just now, the scientists are beginning to understand this. It's like anybody who's actually been in dialogue with somebody else has known this intrinsically since the beginning of time. I mean,
yeah, science is validation, and people don't realize that. People think like, the science comes first, and then the world's. No, science is proper science is based on observation, which means it comes last. You observe the thing first, then you come up with a bunch of hypotheses, then you narrow that down, then you get a theory, then you keep testing it forever until it breaks, and then you get a better theory, right? That's how science is supposed to work according to scientific method. We can argue about there's other types of sciences, but like no one's ever shown me one that I can hang my hat on, we'll say. So I'd rather stick with the one that we know, that's been defined, that's been around for a while, rather than the one you came up with last week that no one uses. So
would you say it's sort of a method of putting a fence around or putting a boundary around something that you've been analyzing? I mean,
but it's just validation, right? It's just validation. Like, I have an idea. How do I validate my idea? How do I make sure my idea isn't dumb? fair enough. Like, it's sort of like outsourcing sanity, which I don't think they're talking about in this talk, but outsourcing sanity, right? That concept. It's the same thing, right? Well, how do we outsource our validation to something that isn't prone to our cognitive bias? Well, that's the scientific method. That's basically what it does. But it's validation, and validation in any process comes last. Like, the thing has to be built before you can validate it. It has to be
Well,
there. It has
sure,
to be
but I mean
evident and obvious.
that implies a bias before you even get started, because to even
What is
have
this
the
Peterson's
idea
law?
and to even choose what you want to validate is already a bias.
That's one of Peterson's core points,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
science doesn't work without religion, because religion tells you what to care about,
yeah,
right? It's like,
yeah.
oh, okay, right. And he goes into the Ebola and anthrax example that Russia did.
Mhm.
And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Right. And everybody
Yeah.
reverses that and said, no. Religion is dependent on science. And I'm like, well, first of all, unless you just never read a history book, that can't be true, because religion was way before everything. Religion came before farming. I actually think they go into that in this talk at some point, right? Religion came way before everything else. It was the first thing that happened. Science didn't come till relatively recently, guys, like,
Mhm.
historically speaking.
Yeah.
So it hasn't. Science may get wiped out by evolution, for all anybody knows, which would be ironic, by the way. But I don't know. I'm not making a claim. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. But the fact that the science backed up this dialogical aspect, I thought was really interesting, to your point.
Science might get wiped out by science.
Exactly.
Have you ever read that book? Oh, and of course the title just slips my brain. Yeah.
I'm not well read, so the answer's
Oh,
probably no anyway.
okay. Anyway, it's about a time far in the future where everybody is still a monk living in a monastery someplace, just trying to recapture some little piece of information that was left over after everything was destroyed by the bombs and everything else, and someone will know the book, I'm sure. It's quite an interesting book. It's one that Esther O'Reilly is always pushing.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, she's always on that one. So the next thing that Jordan says is that thought has two main components: the revelatory, which manifests itself in flashes of insight, religious revelation, that which, and I thought this was interesting, that which springs out of the void.
Yeah.
Consciously or unconsciously posing yourself a problem akin to prayer. But we've internalized prayer so deeply, we don't even know when we're doing it.
Yeah.
Sometimes the answer appears, I thought that up. And then he quotes Jung. He says he paraphrases Jung, because I think she's conscious of the fact that people are saying he doesn't really know Jung and he is always misusing Jung. And so he doesn't want them to go off to Jung and try to find this quote. So he says, it's not an exact quote, it's just a paraphrase. Most people encounter thoughts like they encounter a table when they enter a room. It's just there.
Right. Yeah. And well, he in here too, he also mentions dialogue and trialogue with ourselves, right? And he talks about, we ask a question and wait, and the answer appears, right? And it's like, yeah. And then John kind of validates this. He says, the insight process makes use of different cognitive machinery from inferential machinery. So he sort of validates there's two types of thought and there's two types of cognitive processes, and the CogSci agrees. I mean, that's, and then Jordan like very quickly jumps over to this editor module thing, right? And how that intertwines with writing, and he kind of goes, he goes crazy. But they're on the same page. There's no disagreement, and they're in exploration mode. They're exploring.
So then Jordan says, when people develop prefrontal dementia, sometimes they experience a burst of creativity.
Right.
And
yeah.
there was a little part of
that up.
There was a little part of me that wondered if, and I'm going to be very transparent right here myself. I had heard this idea a little while back, and since my big burst of creativity started when I started painting when I was 50, and then kind of cracked open the creativity box when I was about 55, and nonstop ideas just flowing since then. But especially since I started listening to Jordan Peterson, it's like I can't shut off the flow. It's just this constant flow of thought and ideas. And maybe you could call them insights, and all of that. And so and then I heard him say this again today, and I thought, yeah, I've wondered about that. If there is something about your brain kind of burning out just before you get Alzheimer's or something like that, and then he said this, and I thought, oh, I'm wondering if maybe he is a little worried about that, because he's on fire all the time, and he can't shut it off, right? So I wonder if there's a little part of him he knows the science on this, and that's got to be a little terrifying when you're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, and who knows, what that is or how that works. But yeah, I mean, they're on the same page. And, Peterson's talking about writing, causing that, the non-critical revelatory process, right? Because the editor mode is off while you're writing. And, he likens that to prayer, right? He says, do you think that is akin to prayer? And that's pretty radical, right? And then
so let me just interject something from Ian McGilchrist on this, because the way Ian McGilchrist talks about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and it may be because of the way it comes through my own frame, but the way I kind of understand it is that the left hemisphere has more of this scientific mode of categorizing and structuring and restructuring and utilizing that kind of a mode. And the right hemisphere is open to the outside and open to revelation. And so I'm wondering if this editing process when writing is similar to what I do when I'm painting, when you try to shut down the left hemisphere so that the right hemisphere can just operate in this like flow state.
Right.
And the way I do it when I'm painting is to listen to Jordan Peterson or Paul Vervaeke videos, because that engages my left brain. And then when my left brain is engaged, I can't use any of my left brain for my painting. Now, obviously, when you're writing, I don't think you could be listening to lectures and still be writing and to shut off to get to the revelatory thing, but you have to find some way of shutting off that editor.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, John doesn't like the left brain, right brain model. I kind of agree. I mean, we kind of use it like in our 4Ps model, like we went over in our first video, but actually we're not trying to map it Cartesially, right? We're actually not.
But that's not at all what McGilchrist is doing.
Right.
Not at all.
I think of it as parallel thought modes. Doesn't matter where they're physically happening, right? But it's easier to divide it into left and right, just so that you have some way to deal with it.
Because okay. So, but just let me clarify what McGilchrist is saying, that the past viewpoint on what the left and right brain are doing is incorrect. When you go into the cognitive science, there are many parallels between what both hemispheres are doing.
Right.
But there are a few things that are singular only to one or the other. And this ability to apprehend what is outside the person is only coming from the right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere only gets what the right hemisphere gives it. So although the processing may be, have you read his book?
No.
Okay.
I'm familiar with this argument, though I don't like it.
Well, I mean, if you read the book, you probably see it in a completely different way, because he's got the research there, man. He's got 20 years of in-depth. He's got 100 pages of attributions, and Jordan Peterson. I think Jordan Peterson totally gets him. So I do think there's something there.
They were on the same wavelength for sure.
Yeah.
And I think when you're talking about the higher level up structures, though, then because the way we divide our model is discrete versus continuous signaling, right? And that, for us, that works really well because it works at the high level. It doesn't really rely on left and right. The reason why we make the left-right distinction is because there is an aspect that is unique to each side, to your point, right? But also it doesn't really matter which side that processing happens on, but it does matter how it's applied, right? And so, because you can cross apply it in the model, and that actually produces different results according to our model. So that's why I use the left right. When we stole most of this work from Struan on the server, who has a much deeper and stranger model for how he's mapping all of Vervaeke's 4Ps, and he goes all the way back to ancient Greek conceptions and crazy things that we don't really go into.
Well, do you see any? So this is a little off topic, but do you see any analogies to the discrete and continuous, to the masculine and the feminine?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Who's in touch with cycles, right? And who cares about building discrete things? Like, yeah, it's all there. We can tie everything back to.
And see, and when I read McGilchrist, even though he would argue vigorously against me, everything I see says that his model of the left hemisphere and his model of the right hemisphere map right onto masculine and feminine, not male and female, because male and female, there's a lot of intersection in the way the brain, in the way our brains work and the way our hemispheres work, but just the masculine essence, or the masculine,
Well, and that allows for the point to be made that you can have more female men and more male, right?
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't work. So making that distinction is actually super important to match the world. Like, I would say it's a better map of reality, or some more accurate map. So yeah, I agree. And look, they do, like I said, they do go into this, right? Because he's talking about the editor model being down. So okay, and Vervaeke doesn't seem to think the match between the critical revelatory process and this whole editor model module and prayer is radical. He doesn't think so, which I found interesting. So this is more a case where they're not in disagreement, whether there's interruptions or not. And in this first section, I think there's only one interruption so far, according to my notes. So it's not like there's a lot of interruptions in the first like eight or 9 minutes here.
So are you confident that when John says that's not radical, that he's actually saying that because that's what he believes? Or might he be saying that because he's so gracious in conversation? He always wants to make the other person feel comfortable and not feel as though they've made a mistake or something.
No, again, there's the Canadian aspect, right? I'm not a particular fan of Canadians. But, and John tries very hard not to be too Canadian, which is really funny, because honestly, and I love John, he doesn't pull it off very well. Like, sometimes he does a better job than most Canadians of not being too Canadian, but really it kind of shines out. I think Peterson does a much better job, probably because he was at Harvard in Boston, and boy, you'll learn not to be Canadian in Boston pretty quick. I grew up in Boston, man. They're nasty people. But Paul Vanderkleen made the comment. He's like, oh yeah, you don't mind interruptions, huh, New Englander? And I'm like, yeah, exactly. New Englanders, Northeasterners in general, right? We all interrupt each other all the time. It means nothing. So, but I think I think that because John's a very good faith actor with Jordan, again, because they're academics. I think and I don't know, but I think what he's referring to is there is evidence for this, right? It's not counter to any possible science or something. I think that's very much the spirit that John operates in. Like, he would tell you, well, it's not backed up in the cog side, but it's still possible. That's probably what he'd say. The fact that he's saying he doesn't think it's radical means there's some basis for it in my mind. That's how I think.
But then I guess we have to ask, when Jordan and John are saying revelatory and they're saying radical or not radical, or even if they're saying it's not radical, they mean something different by revelatory than maybe what Paul Vanderkleen would mean by revelatory.
I don't.
Or not.
Think so.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't think so. From my interactions with John, he knows full well what revelatory means, right? Now, what I would say is the way even a Calvinist like Paul Vanderkleen claims to be, would couch a revelatory experience. The framework they would use to draw a connection would be different from the framework John would use John would use a more Buddhist framework, right? It's non-theist, it's not linking to anything. And actually, I would go into a big argument here, which is totally speculative on my part, about needing that connection, and that the personification itself is important, because that's the deepest kind of relationship we could have, blah, blah, blah. But I think everybody's talking about the same revelatory. And I think that that Peterson leans more on the revelatory, like in the drug side, although that's not what he's actually pointing at. And I think Paul would be like, no, you fools, it's all right up to Jesus or something, right? Like right up to God or whatever.
Well,
Whereas
no, but wait, so when you say that the drug thing, then, so it is a different thing then, because you're saying basically that they're looking at revelatory as being something that arises out of the collective unconscious or the world mind or something like that.
Yeah, so John would use world mind. He's a Neoplatonist, roughly speaking,
Okay.
right? He would definitely use that. But I mean, if you look at Neoplatonism, and I'm no expert, but like I did take his Cultivating Wisdom course, so you know, we're working through the book, The Wisdom of Hypatia. It's back behind me somewhere on the floor, no doubt. I pull that out every Saturday when we do our book club for it. Yeah, the Christianity is sitting right in Neoplatonism, right? You said, I think before, right? Oh, we just consider them proto-Christians. It's like, oh, fair enough. They look like proto-Christians from all sides, pretty much. So, but I don't think those are different things, right? They're just talking in a different framework about literally the same thing, and I think they agree it's the same thing. They just don't agree what the other side of it is.
If they're calling it a thing, then they're not.
Well, yeah. I'm calling it a thing, right? But I do think they're using the term revelatory in exactly the same way. I just think the only real difference is whether or not they're linking it to a God, right? And then so the revelatory experience comes down from below, right? That would probably be something that Paul Vanderklay would couch it in, right? Whereas John would say, like, it pops out of the Neoplatonic nous, world mind, or whatever, right? Whereas Jordan would say, yeah, this stuff is there for sure, and like drugs can bring it out, and also maybe there's other things, right? Like, but they're really all talking about exactly the same thing. It's just what's the destination or what's the source, but the thing's the same.
So whether it's coming up from the bottom or coming down from the top,
or coming middle out. I think middle out is the Neoplatonic argument, roughly speaking.
Okay. So, but that would be sort of Jonathan Pageau's picture of the hierarchy, and also the way Jordan Peterson has always talked about the hierarchy as being the place where the top comes down and gathers up the bottom and brings the bottom up, and there's this constant recycling of, yeah. Okay.
Right.
Well,
right.
I think I got it. Let's go on here. So then John is responding to this about, what do you think about its akiness to prayer? And John starts into this description of that the empiricist is thinking that your relationship to thought is, that's one of the words I lost there.
Passive/receptive or romantic.
Or, that's what it was. Empiricism or any kind of knowledge is a passive receptive relationship to thought. Yeah.
Yep.
Or you may be a romantic, where you think that any thought is a literal expression, a pushing out, an imposition on the world. Now, I have to jump in here. I had this weird thought, because I've been reading a lot about, I've been talking about entropy on my channel for 2 years, and recently been reading a lot of very interesting stuff. And the other day, I was reading this article about or I heard Sabine Hassenfelder talking about dark matter. And she said dark matter is the same thing as regular matter, except that regular matter has an internal pressure. And I thought, that I hadn't heard that before, so I had to start doing a little research to figure out what she meant by that. The internal pressure that's in matter sort of pushes out within whatever the container is, and that causes the world outside to give way a little bit. Okay. Mm-hmm. So everything has a little bit of internal pressure that's kind of pushing out and making space for itself, sort of. And that space actually disappears from outside, because the pushing out is lessening the outer space, right? And then I started to do some reading on dark matter, and apparently one of the theories is that dark matter actually has a negative pressure, which causes the world outside to expand into it. which is actually stretching space. That's why dark matter, and because they know space is expanding. I mean, they know the universe is expanding. That's time and space together, but they know the universe is expanding. And the only way they've been able to find an explanation is to posit this idea that there is dark matter out there. And they know that the universe is expanding faster than it used to. So then they posited dark energy to explain that. So when he started saying that any thought is a literal expression of pushing out, then that made me think that even a thought has a boundary. So even a thought has some essence, is a thing that takes up space in the world. And it has an outer pressure.
Well, but he actually says here, he says, empiricism versus romanticism, but he says, I think it's participatory and it's a co-creation we are doing together. And the interesting thing is, what's the object of the we? Because if you're going back to revelatory, now you're into that noose concept again. Like, well, what is that? Right? Is that the drug? Is that the God? Is that the noose? Like, what's the we there? Like,
so you think he's not just talking participatory dialogue between you and me, but could also be participatory dialogue between me and wherever that revelatory information is coming from?
That's the frame I have here, and maybe my notes are incomplete, but that's what Jordan was talking about. Now, you can always argue, because this happens throughout the talk, right? We talked about this before. John's trying to go one way and Jordan tries to drag him back. Like, no, stay here, right? So he does that a lot. And, my only comment on this section was, this doesn't explain. So John really didn't explain, and like Jordan didn't really explain either, right? They didn't explain what they were talking about, but I got a deep sense from this section that opening, that understanding by Jordan was something that he was satisfied with as a frontier for furthering his thought. Which is
yes, especially when John says that participating in a conversation, we're co-creating, we're collaborating together. It's the dialogos, because that co-creating thing,
right?
You and I talking right now, we may not even realize anything that we might be creating together. I mean, so far it doesn't feel like we've created anything together, but other people listening, as they're listening, they're hearing other things than what we're saying. And so that creates that something new in the middle, right?
Right. But again, the frame of this from Jordan's perspective was very much a revelatory. As far as I can tell, they didn't get out of that frame. In which case, John's not talking about two people. He's talking about the co-creation with nature or something, right? And you can use that, I think, in the Greek framework. I think that works fine in the Neo-Platonic framework. So yeah, I found that interesting. But yeah, it wasn't really the sort of explanation that I would have sort of expected from an explanation. But it was the sort of thing where I was like, oh, this is dialogos. They're both on the edge, and they're both happy with not going further, right? Like, oh, if we go one step further, 1 millimeter further, we're both going to be lost, right? But this gives us a platform of agreement from which to spring forth in our own thoughts. So I'll be interested to see if something like that comes out, in the next talk. I guess it's going to be with Pageau. So it's going to be Pageau and Peterson and Vervaeke. And that, again, like, I don't know what the beauty is going to look like. I don't know how it's going to manifest, but it's going to be a beautiful talk. I guarantee that. I'm so looking forward to that.
Yeah, Jonathan has a new one out that is just wonderful. And he's talking with some guy. I don't know who the guy is, but the title of the talk is The Inevitability of Religion. And it's just wonderful. So if you and I can get to places in the dialogos we couldn't get to individually, that's Philia Sophia, the love of wisdom, as opposed to Philia Nikeia, the love of victory. And that was new to Jordan, obviously, because but he did jump in with, well, wisdom is the feminine essence of God, interestingly.
Yes. Yeah, I have that in my notes as well.
Right. Yeah, and I'm sure that's coming out of Proverbs Chapter 8.
not a theologian, so I don't know.
Oh, well,
The
then
interesting thing, though, this section begins with.
while you're talking, I'm going to look up Proverbs chapter 8
Sure.
and bring it
Sure.
out to you, because you'll see exactly what he's
So
talking about.
this whole section begins with, well, this gets to the point of why people want us to talk, right? So we can think, right? And my notes are presumably together. And then John invokes Socrates, Philia Sophia, Philia Nikeia, love of wisdom, feminine essence of God comes in, right? Philia, the shared love. And then at 10 minutes, they're going back and forth on this whole Philia Nikeia, Philia Sophia thing, because it's the what does Paul Vanderklee call it, the crazy Vervaeke words, right, or crazy Vervaeke language, right? So Jordan has to catch up with the Greek terms, right? But he interrupts. YouTube is Philia Sophia, and John agrees, and they both say people like that better, and it's like, yeah, I don't know what research you're looking at, but that's not true, right? But they found an audience for it, and that audience is big. I absolutely agree. It's just that not most people. And they allude to that later on, further down, 20 minutes down, when they talk about the t-shirt, because that's actually what Jordan's saying. So unlike what he's saying here, he's saying the opposite when he's talking about the t-shirt, about most people, what most people can do, what the cognitive capacity of most people is. Right. And people can very easily see an argument, a debate, and who's on which side. With exploration, if you're not, up for the exploration even, and sometimes I'm not, sometimes I just want to fight with people. I just want the debate. I just want an answer. Right. But if you're not in that space, you're not in that space. And some people can never be in that space because they're not comfortable with exploration. They want the dogma, right? They want to be dogmatic, right? They'll act dogmatically. And some people are just there. And that's where that comes from. It comes from the people. So did you find the quote?
I did, yes. And I think I'm going to share screen so we can actually read along, because I think that'll make it easier for people. And I always look like the deer in the headlights when I'm doing share screen, because I'm never sure if I'm doing it right. But let's get here. Yeah, you can see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. This is from the New American Standard Version, which is pretty authentic, tries to be as authentic as possible to the original language. So it's not as, say, beautifully written as the King James. It's not as poetic, because they're trying to actually get at what the Hebrew is saying. So, does not wisdom call, and understanding raise her voice on the top of the heights beside the way where the paths meet? She takes her stand beside the gates at the opening to the city. At the entrance of the door, she cries out, "To you people I call, and my voice is to mankind. You naive ones, understand prudence, and you fools, understand wisdom. For I will speak of noble things, and the opening of my lips will reveal right things. My mouth will proclaim truth, and wickedness is an abomination to my lips." Goes on like that, like accept my instruction and not silver, and acknowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all desirable things cannot compare with her. Then I, wisdom, dwell with prudence and find knowledge and discretion. Now I'm going to skip on down to verse 22 so you see why Jordan is saying what he's saying. Verse 22, the Lord created me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From eternity I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. When there were no ocean depths, I was born. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the hills, before the mountains, all of that. Wisdom.
Right. Well,
wisdom,
and it starts out saying she's feminine, right? Like it's
yeah.
wisdom, the woman. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that's why he's saying that that wisdom is the feminine. So.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That looks right to me. Oh, I'm out of my depth.
So we were at 10 minutes, I think.
Yeah, 10 minutes. And they're basically discussing YouTube and the number of viewers, and 10,000 people with him and Harris, right? And this is and he says,
I think this is when I started getting uncomfortable. This is where I started. Yeah, because, I told you after 20 minutes, the first time I watched it, I stopped. And it felt a little cringy to me. And I didn't want it to feel cringy because I have nothing but admiration for Jordan Peterson. And I really do think that I misunderstood what he was doing here. But the first time I heard it, it felt like he needed people to know that there were a lot of people listening to him. On the one hand, John is saying, well, there's this many people listening to me. And on the other hand, Jordan is saying, well, there were 10,000 at my live talk and it sounded a little bit like one-upping. And
right.
It felt uncomfortable. It just felt because it didn't seem concordant with his personality and actions in the past. And so it felt uncomfortable to me.
Right. But from an academic perspective, right. And I'm not an academic, but I'll try to bring one because, okay. I'm going to rely on my growing up in Boston and hanging out in Harvard and MIT and all these other schools, because I did do that. What they're actually doing and the frame of this whole thing is, look, YouTube is Phileia Sophia. John agrees, and people like that better. That's the thesis that's set forth before they start talking. That's the initial talk about YouTube. So now when you're talking about YouTube in an academic setting, what are you doing? Well, now you're in the scientific measurement realm. That's where you are. You're kind of stuck with numbers. Fair enough. Like I have a great deal of fondness for science myself, even though vastly misused by people who should know better or claim to know better, right? And so they do go into this, but what they're actually doing is comparing. Are you seeing on YouTube what I'm seeing on YouTube, right? And then there isn't a straight comparison because the base audience is different for each guy. Like Vervaeke has a much smaller audience than Peterson, and so does almost everybody else on YouTube. My YouTube channel is like 67 subscribers today. Like I'm much smaller, right? So fair enough, right? But they really are trying to pick at, look, are we reading this correctly? That Phileia Sophia is popular? Because that's the core question at the beginning of this whole thing. And then John is he's using this, and he says this explicitly. He's trying to understand dialogos. What is it about? And he talks about doing participant observation and participation, and he lists a bunch, right? He says, I'm learning and sharing. And so he's listing YouTube among his academic sources for his thesis, that Phileia Sophia is popular and that this has something to do with dialogos. Like that's what he's doing here in my mind. It was very clear to me. Like I said, I didn't bat an eye. I'm like, well, this all makes sense. They're doing observation on their observed data. And it's like, my data says this. Does your data say this? And John's going, oh, my data says this too. Right. So it's not competitive, although I can see why somebody would go there. That totally makes sense to me. And then
is this the section where at the end Jordan said, when he said something about there's a million? Oh, the million views thing, that comes later, doesn't it? When he's talking about his video with Jonathan.
Yeah, that comes later, right? I think here, Vervaeke stops talking about his learning and sharing. And then, because I actually have a note, no interruption here, right? Because he's not interrupting for once, right? But Peterson says, feels like we are tracking.
Right? Oh yeah, this is where I have a lot of notes on this section.
Right.
And I also want to just say to people, when John Vervaeke said, I just did 2 conversations with Bernardo Kastrup, has he published those already?
I think those are published. Yeah, I think those were 2 voices of Vervaeke.
Somehow I missed those because I've been listening to a lot of Bernardo Kastrup lately, and I didn't know that he had done a conversation with John. So there's a wonderful one between Bernardo Kastrup and Mark Vernon. It brings out a completely different side of Bernardo Kastrup.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The interesting thing here, though, is that, like I said, Peterson says it feels like we're tracking, he uses that word, links it to Phileia Sophia. And John interrupts Peterson. You guys, Peterson keeps interrupting. John interrupted Peterson a fair bit too. And like, it wasn't adversarial. They were, many of the interruptions, even by Peterson, were agreement interruptions. They were, they weren't, he wasn't stopping the flow of conversation. He was encouraging John to go further. He was agreeing with him. So he knew, I see where you're going, because John was getting kind of far ahead, and Jordan has a tendency to do the same. And feedback is nice. I mean, this is one of the things I do with Manuel, and we do together all the time, right? We're constantly encouraging each other or discouraging each other based on what we're seeing. And
so
then,
what was the point at which John interrupted him? Because I seem to be missing that in my transcript. Jordan, I think you're saying the part here where Jordan says, what do you think of this? You're a participant observer, and I feel like we're tracking something with this.
and then John interrupts.
Even before Jordan gets to the Lord of the Rings reference?
Yes. He says, it feels like we're tracking. He links it to Philia Sophia, and John says, very much. Right? So he's agreeing to the fact that they're tracking, and that they're tracking Philia Sophia. So in other words, I think, my interpretation, and this is all my interpretation is that what John's actually saying is, you're seeing a link to Philia Sophia, I'm seeing a link to Philia Sophia, and we're tracking each other. That's what he's, right? And that tracking is there. The Philia Sophia to the data is tracking, and our data sets are tracking, and our observations are tracking. I think all three, that's what I think he's agreeing to.
Because other people saw in that an analogy to tracking, like you're out in the wild, you're tracking, you have an aim to capture something and kill it. and that's what a lot of other people saw there. And I saw something completely different than either of those things.
Well, to be fair, they immediately jump into, Peterson starts talking about hunting. Okay.
Yeah. Well, isn't that part of the tracking metaphor?
Well, he says goes into hunting, exploratory, mutual tracking. Does this go back to tracking? And then he says dialogical hunters, right? And so if you didn't get the metaphor, because, John talks a lot about, and he does talk about it briefly in here, exaptation, right? Where we're using a part of our brain for something it wasn't intended for, but that new use is better in some sense. And so if you use tracking to track a non-physical object, then you've exapted the tracking section, or maybe the whole hunting section of your brain, to hunt down new ideas, right? So if there's a beast of wisdom, which is what they talk about later, the beast of wisdom that they're tracking and hunting, yes.
But see, that's where I think Peterson was saying something different than that, though. Yes, he's using the same terminology, but just follow me here for a second. He says, I believe this is from Lord of the Rings with Bilbo. So he might have got that wrong. I don't
got that wrong.
I think, yeah, it's from, isn't it from Frodo? Yeah. Because I remember a scene near the end of the book where he makes his way across a swamp full of holes, stones or something.
Dead people. It's the swamp
skulls of dead people. Yeah. And
from the first battle with,
he feels them out, but it's this kind of idea of walking across stones that are just under the water. You're not quite sure where they are. Right.
Right.
And then he says, Philia Sophia, you feel your way to something solid, and then you take the next step. Is that mutual tracking?
Right.
Now, so when he gave that illustration of kind of feeling your way through step by step, it made me think of what it's like when you're actually trying to come to know another person. Maybe it's in a love relationship, or maybe it's a new friend. You're actually trying to get to know them. You're feeling your way around little by little, trying to understand where the connections are and trying to understand where they're different. And one time I heard this illustration that I thought was so powerful. The guy was talking about what does it mean to really love another person enough that you are willing to try to come alongside them and help them to grow and come alongside them and really know them. He said it's a little bit like you're running your thumb along the edge of their soul. And the fingerprint on your thumb is so sensitive that you can feel every bump and every scar.
Yes.
And all of a sudden that made me think about when a person is really coming to know Christ, it's like you're putting your hands in the scars. You're touching the scars. That's what you're coming to know. And it feels to me when he says tracking that he's actually, it's more like a hunger. It's more like a hunger than it is like yeah, I don't have the words to put it into, but many times during this talk, he says, what does this mean? Where is this going? That's not a I want to conquer this kind of a thing. That's a something is calling me and I don't understand what it is.
Right. So I'll go back to intelligibility, and I have a video on this on my YouTube channel. But I'll go back to intelligibility, right? What we really want is intelligibility. We want to understand things. We want to understand how they're connected, how they're together, right? What the pattern is. We want to understand the pattern, to invoke Pageau. And of course, the name of my channel is Navigating Patterns. So I talk about patterns, and I'm setting up to talk about more patterns. So it's intelligibility that he's after, right? And that's what tracking is. Right. And to be fair, look, Peterson goes back. He says wisdom is a beast. He says that. So he goes back to the hunting and killing metaphor. So it's
but what does that mean with the beast? If you go back and read the poem, it doesn't mean that.
Well, right. Well, just think how, I mean, it's absurd. Wisdom is a beast. Do you slay wisdom? No, of course not. Right. And so he's not drawing the metaphor well, in my opinion. I think this is a mistake it's a familiar conversation.
Well, no,
right?
But when he says slouching toward Bethlehem under his, you know, the poem, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. But if you go back earlier in the poem, the kind of language that's used, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand.
Right.
And the vast image out of the spiritus mundi troubles my sight. A waste of desert sand, a shape with lion body and the head of a man. What rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches. So the beast he's talking about, and he's trying to connect the beast with the feminine side of wisdom and the feminine image of wisdom, and with this shape with a lion body and the head of a man. And I think what he's getting at is that in the scriptural reference in Revelation at the second coming is that the ideal who is a judge comes back as a judge. I mean, he talks about that a lot in his biblical series well, and
it's interesting because, again, so Peterson saying wisdom is a beach. John actually tries to interrupt twice, but Peterson keeps going because Peterson, and that might have upset people. But the interesting thing is, John drags it in the right direction, surprisingly enough. He says, yes, you are right. The main claim of 4e cog sci. So, which is something I'm assuming, I don't pretend to understand this part all that well because it's very deep, right? Socrates talks about a willingness to follow the logos wherever it goes. What does it mean to follow something? You're tracking it. That's what it means. That's following and tracking are closely, they may not be the same thing, but they're closely related, right? And then Jordan interrupts again to drag John back into Jordan's frame, which again, I actually think John was doing fine. But he says, do you think this is any different from prayer? Because you could hardly say it in a more Christian way. So it's basically saying, John, you're talking like a Christian again.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That happens a lot. Right. And then John says, yeah, in participant observation, people are taken aback by a kind of intimacy, which is kind of interesting language, that is not sexual. It is a kind of immediacy that the culture doesn't prepare them for. And they are not prepared for. And Peterson goes, God, which I thought was so fascinating, right? Because it's just like, yeah, you can say that again, right? It's that sort of a God, right? It's not a God, right? And it was just a fascinating moment for me. And John continues, so they are taken aback by this kind of intimacy and connection. And the interesting thing for me is that I've been tracking and stalking like a beast this idea that the meaning crisis didn't come first. The meaning crisis is a primarily male problem. Not that it doesn't affect females. Of course it does. It has to. Duh. What came first was the intimacy crisis. And so I'm hoping at some point, I can't do it, I'm a guy, but I'm hoping at some point I can figure out what this intimacy crisis is and have some women talk about it, because I don't know anything about intimacy for lots of reasons that, you know, hopefully came out in my first talk with Paul, right? About how I grew up and such not. But it's interesting that they're talking about intimacy here, and they actually.
So I don't want to leave our viewers in the lurch here, because I feel like I'm a little bit in the lurch. I have some vague idea of what you mean when you say the intimacy crisis came first, but what are you actually saying?
So what I'm tracking, and this is all like super speculative stuff.
Oh, that's
right?
okay. That's okay.
Yeah, I'm way out on the fringe of what I'm trying to track.
I have about 200 viewers, so I think it's okay.
That's okay. You'll have more after this, because these are awesome, right? Good comments over here, I noticed, to your point. Yeah, well, I think that basically what I'm getting at is, if you're not making good, solid connections in the world, if you're not able to connect with other people in that fashion that John's talking about here, these guys are both talking about this intimacy and this immediacy, right? Where you're instantly getting this really strong connection to somebody else. If you're not able to do that, then you're not able to find meaning, because meaning has to involve intelligibility. And intelligibility is how the world's connected. It's the patterns that we see in the world that give us, dare I say, faith, or at least trust, if not both, right? That we can predict, that we can navigate, not that we will, and that because we could predict and navigate in some cases, that we have some form of control, right? Because meaning to some extent is about control, ultimately. If we feel like we don't have any control, meaning doesn't matter anymore. Right? These are all tied together. They're intimately tied together, I would say. Meaning, control, intelligibility. And again, I have a video on intelligibility and control where I say, look, most people don't want control of most things. Crazy people like me who are controlling do, but that's a different problem. I have my own issues. So, but most people are like, look, I'll just let this system or this narrative take that over because it's intelligible. I trust it. I think I know enough about how it works that I don't need to worry about it. I'm not expecting it to be perfect, but I don't need to worry about it. And then those people are more resilient, right? Because they don't, they have enough of a connection, right? And then they can focus their connection and their intimacy energy on other things, which like other people, right? Or like religion, right? Or intimate connection with higher power, right? They can do all that. So if you can't do that, let's say you're a Sam Harris fan and you don't have a frame outside yourself. This is the problem with Sam Harris, is the highest frame is my ego in Sam Harris's model, right? And then there's no room for redemption by the group. You can redeem somebody, but you can't say, hey guys, we all got to get together and redeem somebody, because everyone's going, no, my frame's the highest frame, go away. I don't care about your opinion, my opinion. And then everyone's got 6 different opinions, and there's 5 people with 6 opinions, and you can't get together on that. And this goes back to what we were talking about in the first talk, where there's all these groups, they don't align. So you got a bunch of small groups. You need intimacy to get alignment, because you have to be able to privilege these connections and say, well, maybe no electricity is a little extreme if I want to actually have a relationship with all of these other people so we can build great things. And I'll settle for pulling these other people in the direction of less electricity. And that way I'm not an extremist and they're not extreme in their use of electricity. And now instead of being a crazy environmentalist green person off, bombing substations or whatever the heck these people do, we can all get along and build something together instead of destroying things, right?
So how far back do you take the intimacy crisis?
I'm going to defer. I have 3 good, interesting moments, right? So my thesis is based on time frame. And so one thing I will refer to without making a claim on my own thoughts here. Peterson mentioned at one point birth control, and I'll note that the widespread use of birth control, and by widespread I mean I'll crudely use some numbers, 30% of the population roughly, right? I'm sort of culminating that from Taleb and data science and a bunch of other stuff that I know that's really not all that interesting, but it's tied up with computers, which is what I do for a living, right? roughly 30% of the population, roughly using something that disrupts the hormonal balance, right? Or even not necessarily directly disrupts the hormonal balance, but disrupts the hormonal relationship, because that's what intimacy is about, right? It's a type of relationship. That's about 2 generations out. And about 2 generations out, the first generation has a devastating effect, but the second generation, their top end experience of something like femininity per se, or the divine feminine, if we want to couch it in those terms, would mean that the next generation, the effect of that birth control, that disruption, is devastating. Because I'm tracking everything on local timeline. Like, I don't think it's, and I love John's stuff, and he traces it all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and Paul goes way back. And I'm like, guys, this stuff is happening at a greater rate now. We have to look at more local, more proximal causes. That would be one candidate for a proximal cause. Right. And then that interestingly tracks with the social. And I don't know which came first, right? Because you can make an argument either way of this, well, if, females can do everything males can do, and therefore, right, those two things come more or less together roughly at the same time, and you'd have a hard time differentiating the two, right? So you could say, oh, well, the third wave feminist movement came first. That's what caused the use of the birth control. You could say the beginnings of use of birth control caused the third wave feminism to explode. I don't have a dog in that fight. I don't care, right? It doesn't matter, because we have to fix it, right? How it started isn't necessarily going to tell us how to fix it. But that would be where the intimacy crisis started, is the intimacy is all on the divine feminine side, right? That the divine feminine is that aspirational aspect to the male. And it's also the thing that gives the connection so that we cooperate better. And so when you lose the connection, we cooperate better. If this thesis is correct, what you would see is a bunch of groups using some lame excuse that's been around forever, like postmodernism, which is actually quite old at this point to some measure, right? Using some lame excuse to deconstruct everything and destroy all the connections because they don't value connection. But if you value connection, you're going to form larger groups and larger communities. You're going to get along with more people. You're going to be, so Jonathan Pageau came on our AftMC server for a Q&A, which is very generous of him. And I think John had something to do with that. Thank you, John. Pageau's awesome. I love Pageau. I could talk to him for months if I could ever get to him. And I'm probably not worthy, so fair enough. Although he is French-Canadian, I'm French-Canadian. So, maybe we can French-Canadian brother this. But he said something very interesting. He said, well, one of the reasons for church is you all get together in a space, and you don't necessarily like each other, and you don't necessarily agree on anything except this one thing, and you're forced to do it, right? And this was absolutely, Manuel and I were both like, oh, we're both going to go commit seppuku now, because that's the one piece we were missing. We're like, oh, this is so obvious, and we kind of missed it. And we're both sort of in denial still, I think. At least I know I am.
And I would add to that, you're not only forced to do whatever that one thing is, but you're with a whole bunch of people you don't know anything about, you have many differences with, right. And you might not even like some of them, or they might not be your kind of person.
You don't like them. Yeah, you have nothing else in common. So the intimacy is forced. And because that loops into the intimacy crisis work, I was like, oh no, that sounds very correct. Let's run away, right? Because now we're skewing too much towards that. The beautiful thing
is that when you do it, then you start to love each other. It's like really crazy.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to the birth control and the female-male equality thing, because I think that one of the places that the female-male issue, I mean, I'm sure it goes back further than this, but if I just look at Second World War with all the men going overseas and all the women being in the factories, right?
80% of the workforce.
That's one side of it, because when
they all went back. They all went back. When the men came back, they all left the factories, almost all of them.
But what was left was the impression women can do anything men can do.
But I don't think they cared, because it's
more complicated, Marco. So just let me finish the thought. Yeah. Okay. The second part of the thought is the other thing that happened in the Second World War is the female aspirational aspect was the pinup girls, where prior to that, the female aspirational thing had been the purity of the women, the purity and the beauty and the mystery. because there used to be a lot more mystery. And when we started in with the pinup girls, and it's all about the bikinis and the long legs, and maybe some of that would have been Hollywood, going back even further. I mean, I don't know where that started, but there's something about
Hollywood I'm in on. I don't like I'm automatic. I
mean, really, it goes all the way back to the garden, so I agree with Paul on that, but
no,
but in the local frame.
I can buy the second argument. I can't buy the first argument. Little known. So I grew up in Lowell, so I know a great deal about the Industrial Revolution in the United States. So what people don't realize is that the first round of the mills were all women, like almost all women and children. That's pretty much the first round, not subsequently. So Lowell, when I left Lowell, I forget, but basically it was 48% immigrant. It was like the largest immigrant population in the US. It was like that for years and years and years, because they took over when the mill girls left as the cheap labor. And the mill girls, and you can say, oh, the mill girls were forced to work in the mills. They weren't forced to work in the mills. They could stay home at the farm. So this is a good deal for them. And the first generation owners actually gave them a good deal with accommodations and meals and all of that stuff. It was when they sold, the second generation owners, and then the pressure from India came in on this whole manufacturing thing. That's when things got bad for them and they left and the immigrants came in. But again, that did not cause the same collapse. A lot of those women, and some of them were managing some of these mills. Like everybody thinks like, oh, there was a glass ceiling. No, there wasn't. Some of them owned mills. Like that's just not true. Like they didn't keep owning mills because they were like, I could do this or I could go have kids. Well, what's more valuable? Evolutionarily, by the way, kids are more valuable. These science people, I'm like, are you sure you understand evolution? Are you sure you're getting the point? So yeah, it's a little weird, right? But they did go back, like but the mystery, that's a good one. I don't have a counter for that. I think that, the pinup girls and anything that involves corruption of Hollywood, I'm like, yes, it's their fault. Let's burn them all down. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking about the first wave feminist writers, and what they were trying to say is, you don't have to stay home and be trapped in this stifled environment that you're in. You can burn your bra and you can go do anything a man can do. And
then maybe that doesn't work without birth control. So maybe it's the intersection of the birth control and the message. I have no dog in that fight. I've got no idea. But I like that idea though, of the removal of the mystery. I think that's something important. Yeah. And then that would lead to the loss of intimacy that they're talking about here. And what they're pointing at in the conversation is the impact of the intimacy. That's really what they're on about, is the impact of the intimacy, which I find fascinating. I'm like, well, this really tracks with intimacy crisis. Like these people are starving for intimacy, and when they're hit by it, it's a big deal to them. Yeah. It's like, wow, that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you something about something John said, because it troubled me a little bit, but there may be more underneath it than what I heard. John Vervaeke says, he's talking about how he's done these episodes in the series where he's talked about Christianity, and he did an episode on agape, which was excellent. And pastors have talked to me, and PBK said that the best description of agape that they've heard. They said it was odd for a non-Christian as well. And then Jordan might have said something in there, but the next thing that John Vervaeke says is, I've done circling. I've been in these events. And so it seemed like the wrong frame to me to say I've been in these events. Because circling is a place where people, I think, I saw the conversation that he had with Guy Sengstock, circling is a place where people open up their deepest, darkest world, right, to each other?
Hopefully not. I've got my own thesis for how circling works. And I actually talked to Guy Sengstock in a Q&A on the AFTMC Discord server. And I actually tried to get in touch with him, but he hasn't gotten back to me. So that was a little strange. But
so maybe I misunderstood the whole circling concept, because when I first heard Guy Sengstock talk about it, I thought, well, that's no different than what we do in small group at church. When sometimes a person does open up about some very deep and dark and hurtful places. And
So when Manuel and I first explored all this, right around the time Guy Sengestok came on, actually, we have some circling practices on this. So we do a bunch of stuff on this. So we do meditation, we do yoga, we do circling, we do a glass bead game, we do a bunch of stuff, a bunch of book clubs, right? So we're experimenting with all this. And when John talks about this, some of this he's getting reports from us on the Discord server, right? So some of this is actually our data too, probably to a much lesser extent. He seems to be like, he did philosophical fellowship with a bunch of people that are on our server. For example, he's got 3 philosophical fellowships you can watch on YouTube that are fascinating. But the thing that we think about circling in particular is that, and Guy Sengestok, to my mind anyway, very much confirmed this, because I asked him, what's the difference between circling and group therapy? And he basically said, yeah, you're going to throw out the commonality and the psychological components. It's not psychological.
Okay, well, a small group in church is not group therapy. So
I know
that. Yeah,
exactly. But it's also not your deepest, darkest whatevers. What it is you take, so if you imagine a round table, a bunch of people come up to the round table. One person takes a thing, maybe it's psychological, right? Maybe it's a deep experience or whatever, and they throw it on the table. That's what they do, okay, metaphorically. And then what happens is they back up, right? And then everybody circles the table around that thing. So in other words, they're using that as a prop. They're not referring to it. They're referring to their relationship to it. So that would be kind of like talking about the transjective. Like, this very much gets to dialogos in my mind. It kind of forces the dialogos. And we have to make a distinction between proper circling and improper circling, because Guy says, look, sometimes it goes wrong. Right. And our worry was, man, this is going to stray to the psychological every time. And people are going
to. So now let me just clarify. So when you say you're circling around it, is that, hold on a second. I need to pause this for a second. So when you say you circle around things, what you're actually saying then is it's similar to saying, oh, I had a similar experience in my life and this is what happened to me?
No. You're saying, when you say that, what my relationship to it is. Right.
Or when you say that, this is what comes to my mind, the way Jordan Peterson says, when you're listening, you should listen and whatever rises in your mind and you share that. Is that?
Yeah, I think good circling, might involve an element of that, or might even involve an element of, while I'm here with all of you and you share that, I feel like, because the feeling that you have with an experience that you or somebody else had by yourself is different than the feeling when you're with a group of people. And what you're trying to engender in circling, I think, and this is just my theory, and maybe Guy Sengestok will disagree, and he's the expert, so don't listen to me, right? Is you're trying to engender that, not what the direct relationship with the thing, with the prop is, with the thing on the table, but your relationship with everybody else while you're all in relationship with that thing. So you're looking at a completely different aspect. Completely different.
Can you give me like an example? Some concrete example?
Sure. So if I said something like, if I put something out on the circling table, we'll call it, right, in the center, and I say, well, I had this experience on this drive, and I saw a cloud, and there was a face, and it felt to me like the face of the divine, right? Nobody would talk about the face of the divine, right? And nobody would talk about how they felt. What they would talk about, in respect to the face of the divine, what they would talk about is, when you say that, it makes me feel like there's a larger world out there available to me, right? So they're not referring to my experience, and I'm not referring to my experience, right? So when it comes back around to me, when I speak, I would say something like, this reminds me that everybody has, an experience that they feel is transcendent, right? I wouldn't be talking about the thing I initially stated. I'd be talking about how I feel with everybody else. But you need the prop. It's a bootstrap, right? It's like it's almost like dogma, right? It's a bootstrap into, right? It's like a creed, right? It's a bootstrap into, it's a step into this higher plane of talking about how we are in relationship to one another, rather than how we are in relationship to the subject.
So that's why when you listen to Jonathan Pageau talk about everybody getting together in church and focusing on the same thing, that's why it lined up for you, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. So I think it is a very similar process. It has some very similar aspects, although I'm not sure how Geisingstock would feel about that. But I do think it's a similar sort of thing. And I think from what I see, a lot of the practices John talks about have direct corollaries in the religious traditions. But none of them match up exactly, right? They're sort of filling different spaces. That would be my thesis anyway.
Well, that's one of the fascinating things to me about when you really get to know people and when you interact with people in the church in small groups and so forth, that when we hear, maybe we hear a message and I've gotten a certain feeling from that message and I thought it meant a certain thing, and I'm making the assumption that that's what the message said.
Right.
But then I hear other people talking and what they heard and how they processed it and what it felt like to them is so completely idiosyncratic to each person.
Right.
And then when you bring all of those together, you get this beautiful whole, which I've always attributed to the beauty of how the Holy Spirit works through each individual. You can all read the same verse and you can all get something deeply meaningful from each person out of that verse. And when you bring them all together, it's even better, right? It just makes these layers.
Well, look, I mean, if you're in a book club or in a Bible study, rather, and I've never been to a Bible study, so I'm speculating to some extent here, right? You're reading a passage, right? And then you're all talking about how you saw the passage. That sounds like circling to me, right? You're all talking about how you saw the thing on the table. And then what you're seeing is all these different perspectives. And that's giving you the higher intelligibility. And I think Manuel likened this to the elephant. So look, one guy comes up to the back of the elephant and says, this is what I feel, right? And describes it as best they can. You can't really describe what you feel, right? Like physically, but you can do an approximation. And the guy at the front of the elephant says, this is what I feel, right? And then the guys at the sides, right? They each, right? And now all of a sudden, you can't do this by yourself. You can only do this with the information in the moment with the other people. Now you get a sense for what the elephant is. That's intelligibility. And John talks about this in terms of distributed cognition. Absolutely. That's a form of distributed cognition. I like the term outsourced cognition a little bit better. I like to use both, but the problem with distributed for me is people think, oh, distributed is better. It's like, it's also outsourced. You're going to be careful. Like if you outsource your cognition to a bad person, like maybe happened before.
Well, the other thing that made me think about though is when Jordan and John, and maybe we're getting past our 30-minute mark, I don't know, but they bring up this whole thing about, John brings up the word negative theology.
Yes.
Which I've always understood as being, or this is something one of my early conversation partners explained to me as apophatic. It's not the God of the gaps, which was John was trying to explain to Jordan because Jordan didn't understand it. Maybe Jordan didn't understand it because John was using this terminology, negative theology, which I've never heard before either.
Right.
But it's this idea that some things are so big and so deep that you can't describe them. You can't understand it, but you can get closer to it if you have a lot of people trying to understand it and trying to get into this space where they get a little bit more information about it.
Right. They do go into that later, right? And I think the reference that John makes is, when you get all these pieces, it starts to look like a globe, which still isn't the right answer. But
that wasn't, I didn't think that was the right answer at all.
Well, I like the analogy, but the fact that he said, well, it's closer. Like a globe is closer than just having one piece of a globe.
Yes, it's
fair enough. Like I don't think that's wrong.
Yeah.
But this section is interesting because there's a lot of nervous laughter where, John's talking about the instant intimacy. Peterson's talking about you don't know them, or maybe you do. Your Philia Sophia knows each other, right? And then he says it's instant intimacy, but it's very disconcerting. So again, they're talking a lot about intimacy. And then John says it's hard for me by nature. And this is where he mentions being socially phobic. And Peterson interrupts him, which is so ironic. He says he's socially phobic, and Peterson interrupts him and says, doesn't get easier. And John does the nervous laughter thing again. And Now that's legitimate nervous laughter, because what he's just basically said is, oh, you think you're socially phobic now? Wait until it's like, good job, Jordan.
Wait until your status rocket takes off and you can't walk anywhere without people coming up and having instant intimacy with you. Yeah.
John is completely allergic to such things, I assure you. Yeah, and then he starts talking about we space and Geist and logos and spirit, right? And then he says there's this sense of, and Peterson interrupts him and says, wherever I am between you, I am with you, right? And then John continues, yeah, so he agrees with the Christian framing. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am also. And I was like, oh, okay, he's doubling down on the Christian framework.
Well, he's actually almost correcting Jordan, because Jordan didn't have the reference correct and John did, right? So,
well, if you say so. We're in theology. Mark knows nothing about theology. So,
well, I mean, John is correctly. Maybe that's the wrong word, but John is quoting the verse. Jordan is just quoting some paraphrase that he just randomly picked some words out of the air to paraphrase that verse. It's not very clear. I mean, wherever I am between you, I'm with you. I don't even know what that means. It sounds like a.
Yeah, I don't know either. But yeah,
sounds like a Rumi or something like that. You know,
a paraphrase. But it's interesting. So John does that, right? Corrects him, and then Jordan says, "Yeah, that's a name for it, all right." Which was really weird, because it didn't quite match what they were talking about. So I don't know what was going on in Peterson's head at that point.
Well, and that's interesting that he used name.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think he says anything arbitrarily.
No, he doesn't. But I could speculate. I'm not gonna. I could speculate, like maybe instead of name, he might have used logos in a slower conversation. But interestingly, John says there's that sense, and Peterson interrupts him at this point, and he says, when did you put the Christian spin on this?
Yeah.
Now, my note is obviously, and maybe that's a little strong, but that's what I wrote. Peterson has heard this stuff before and is wondering where the spin came into his expression of his ideas. So he must be familiar with the ideas. None of this seems new to Peterson. None of it. Right. And so this is, again, my argument is Peterson's way more familiar with John's work than you people realize. Way more. Right? Not completely, maybe not. You know, if you consider John's work to best work or most recent work to be all the YouTube stuff, maybe, because maybe he has watched all the videos. I wouldn't put it past Jordan. He's sitting there reading authors' books the night before he interviews them. The man's not human. It's near as I could. Neither's John, by the way, right? Like, we're way out there as far as I'm concerned. I can't keep up with that stuff. So, yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting. Yeah, I mean, and John's got a lot of nervous laughter in this section. This is just before, it's right 15 minutes or so in, right? And yeah.
Well, and then it goes into that section that we've already discussed. I guess I jumped ahead a little bit when I talked about John's description of agape.
Right. Well, there's a lot of nervous laughter in this section. And I think that's what people were keying in on around 15, 16 minutes. They're keying in on this nervous laughter, and there are interruptions.
You think that's why people are so nervous about the...
Right. Yeah. Right. He mentions agape and PVK, right? And Peterson interrupts and says, oh, so Vanderklay's following you, right? Like, oh, so he knows Vanderklay. He knows what Vanderklay's up to for sure, right? And then
well, the weird part of that was the look he had on his face after he said that.
Right.
I don't know if you noticed that.
There's a lot of weird, yeah, because I'm pausing the video and I'm like, oh, that's an expression, right? I'm
actually paying attention to the thing that struck me when I saw that look on his face, well, that would be saying too much, really, I guess. But as controlled a person as he usually is, it seems that he would have been able to control not letting that expression be there in that situation if he wanted to. So
yeah, but he's not. He's focused on the dialogos. Right. Yeah. And I think that's where we're getting to too. Like when we say like, well, I don't know if I want to go that far, right? We're getting to the edges as well. And that, the logos.
Since we only have a few minutes, I want to jump ahead just a little bit to the next thing that Jordan Peterson's talking about, how when you are talking about anything extraordinarily serious, you're using religious language. And whenever he talks to anybody in therapy, talking about good and evil, who has been touched by malevolence repeatedly, you're on this religious ground. And then he says, what does that mean? And even before John can start to answer that question, because that was one of those questions that just like arose right up out of his deeper self, right? He says, this spirit that we're tracking, that's the spirit that has laid the golden thread throughout history.
Yeah.
Now, what did you take him to mean when he said golden thread?
Yeah, this whole section was a complete mystery to me. I can only refer back to where I'm going with my channel, right? There's patterns in the world. That's the pattern, right? That's the intelligibility that we're tracking. But the interesting thing here is this whole section at 1610, right? Where for me, it starts with the mention of agape and PVK. For me, the interesting thing here is that he launches into this whole thing based on the idea that agape is like, agape starts this line, and he says, they said it was odd for a non-Christian to be doing this. That's what John says. And then Peterson jumps in at this point and says, well, somebody had to.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And then John gives some nervous laughter and he says, well, that's fair enough. And Peterson, this is what I think everyone's really allergic to. So we had all this nervous laughter. We have a little bit more nervous laughter. And Peterson says, God, what a nasty bastard I am. And I think everybody misreads this. I don't think Peterson's talking about his treatment of John. I think he's talking about his treatment of Christian pastors and preachers.
Oh, yeah. I thought that was obvious. Yeah.
Well, but I don't think it's obvious to everybody. I don't think it is. Basically based on John's response. And then again, what happens is, Peterson's apologizing in a way, like I said, for insulting pastors and preachers and priests. And that's kind of remarkable, but I don't think it's John, and not that it's not entirely not John, but interestingly, John goes, no, this is fun. And Peterson goes, yeah. So I found that fascinating. And then John continues, right, about the spiritual language, and Peterson interrupts and says, yeah, in my therapy, right, now we're right where you were, right, everybody starts using religious language. And John interrupts Peterson here and says, I think that's right.
About the golden thread thing. Well,
it's right in the middle of that, right? The spirit we are tracking, that is the spirit which has laid the golden thread, right after Vervaeke interrupts. Vervaeke interrupts again, actually, in the middle of Peterson, right? And he says, well, right, and Peterson continues, and if we dialogue with the ancestral spirit that manifests as God the Father, that's what's different than the logos. Now we're in theology, I'm completely lost.
Well, okay, so I want to go back to the golden thread thing because, well, I have many thoughts about the golden thread thing.
But that's all one thing. Like that's literally all one sentence even. The golden thread, and he says it's different from the logos.
Right, but if you go back to some of Jordan Peterson's teaching in his lecture series, he talks about that little glimmer that's out there in front of you. Right. That kind of, and he said in some mysterious way, it's your future calling you forward.
Yes.
Right.
The aspirational aspect. That's what John, I think, posits this as aspiration per se.
But that would intimate that it's coming, that the aspirational aspect is something in my consciousness that I'm projecting out in front of me, and that is shining out there and drawing me forward. And I don't think that's what Peterson's talking about.
No. Right. No, I think.
Yeah. So I think Peterson, that's the golden thread that's out there. That's what's leading you, is that golden thread. It's, I mean, some people might call it telos, the purpose, the thing that's calling you. Jonathan would call it this theosis thing. I think that's what he's talking about. But I looked up golden thread today on the internet, and strangely enough, there's nothing about that aspect of it. The only thing that's out there are some recent books that have been written using that phraseology, one of them for some computer technology idea, and one of them for some business strategy idea. And the way they both use it is completely different than the way Peterson is using it.
I'm going to take a quick guess that there's an alchemical aspect to the.
There is. I mean, yeah. Yes, there is. And there's also a deeply religious aspect of it, because when I had a long conversation about the golden thread, I think it was with Alex early in the course of my channel, and I can't find it anymore. But one of the commenters talked about, because I was talking about untangling the knot as being somehow connected to that, because I was talking about how threads are woven together when you're making something, and especially if you're making something very complicated. Sometimes you can't tell where the error is when you're making something very complicated.
Right.
And when you finally find the error, you have to unravel a lot of it in order to resolve the error and then start over again, right? And I think somehow that whole business of the untangling the knot and the golden thread are connected somehow through this religious frame. And I haven't worked it all out in my head today because I haven't had time to think. But I think there's something there. And so when Jordan Peterson used that golden thread thing, after it had already come up that one of John's research things is the untangling the world knot. Although he's using it differently. He's using it differently in that frame. But
well, so what's a world knot? Now we're back to the Greek Neoplatonic nous idea, right? We're in that space again, right? And so this is the difference. Now, if you pressed me and you said, well, what do you think aspiration means to John? I think aspiration, rationality, aspiration, rationality, and relevance realization are the three MacGuffins. Right. Those are the three spaces that John's saying, no, this is where all the magic's located. And I'm going to reveal the magic once I get them down to the, once I define these boundaries. Right. And of course, I think that's not going to happen. You're going to get down and like most science, it's going to, right. You know what it is? It's just consciousness. And we're finding a way, one more piece of information will understand consciousness. It's never going to happen. Right?
So that's really his three things. He talks about those three things. Does he bind them together that way as three things?
He doesn't. No. This is just all my conception, right? He talks about aspiration. He hasn't, in my mind, to the best of my knowledge, and I haven't watched all John's stuff, he hasn't defined aspiration. He hasn't defined relevance realization. When he comes across something, he goes, oh, no, that's definitely in the relevance realization camp. And I don't think he's wrong. I'm going to use relevance realization too. We use it in our models. We have more models coming, by the way. That's a thing, right? So we've already whiteboarded some of them and, whatever. We have relevance realization on our map too. Absolutely. We have rationality, but we actually have it in a place. You saw that in the 4 Ps conversation that we did. And that hasn't changed. Rationality is this perspective versus the knowledge that you have, right? You rationalize things by choosing your perspective over the knowledge you actually possess. That's what rationalization, that's how we use the term, right? So rationalization, we have an explanation for. I don't think John's given a good explanation for rationality, but he thinks it solves a lot of problems, right? And then relevance realization is the other magical thing where everything happens, right? And then relevance realization to me just links back to Pageau's concept, the world is attention, right? It's like, oh, right. Because I think what's going to have to happen in John's model, and I don't know this, John could have solved this problem and he just hasn't articulated it yet, or he hasn't, he has, and I haven't seen it, fair enough. But I think what's going to happen is what causes the relevance realization to do what it does? And that's an unanswerable question.
Well, so that's what I wanted to ask you. I've only heard peripherally about his relevance realization, because sometimes when I explain my idea of experiential DNA, people will say, oh, that's John's relevance realization. But I don't think so. So I'm wondering, what's the understructure of John's relevance realization?
I suspect, well, as far as I know, he doesn't really, again, this is where he's pushing things off. He's saying, I'm going to push everything into rationality, aspiration, and relevance realization. And again, I could be totally wrong about this, but
can you define relevance realization?
No, he doesn't. he doesn't. I think he doesn't define any one of those three things.
Well, when Jordan Peterson talks about you put your aim on the highest thing and then things come into your salience field and then you see.
John agrees.
Is that John's relevance realization?
Yeah, it fits in with I think what John's trying to do is he's trying to save science to some extent, in my opinion, and maybe he's not, but that's how I interpret it. But I think what John's trying to do is he's trying to say, look, we can use rationality to fix our relevance realization. So we always have relevance realization that points to reality. I think that's what he's going to do. Like, I don't even see an option for him. And I'm just one person and I'm not the smartest guy in the world. And maybe I'm totally off base, but I do talk about this with people smarter than me. And like, nobody sees a way out of this.
I'm going to play an upside down circling game here. I'm going to throw another frame in the pot. I have no idea if the two frames fit, but let's see if we can, if we see a fit in the frame. Mm-hmm. There's a book by Dorothy Sayers called The Mind of the Maker. And she's talking about creativity as being analogous to God's work in the world, and that there are aspects of creativity that line up with the Trinity. And then she puts it this way, okay? Her creativity Trinity, the mind of the maker, the person who's painting or the person who's making music, okay? There's three parts. First part is the idea. The idea in some ways is passionless and sinless and fully formed when it comes in. And then there is there's the idea, and then there's the making, the process of beginning to end of making whatever it is that you're making. And I mean, she goes into a lot more fullness than this, but sure, I'm simplifying it to the nth degree. The third part is the outworking of the work, the way that it affects other people.
Sure.
Okay. Perfect. And then she says the idea is like the Father, and the making is like the Son, because he's manifest on earth. It's the idea become manifest. And then the outworking is the Holy Spirit, always pointing back to the work, but taking the meaning of the work and investing it in the broader community.
Interesting.
That's a very simple frame, but it came to my mind instantly when you said aspiration, rationality, relevance realization, as though relevance realization lines up with the work of the Holy Spirit, because an aspiration lines up with the idea.
Yep.
Aspiration / inspiration, okay? And the working out, the process by nature, the maker has to struggle all the time against this left brain rationalism to get actual rationality to come out of it. There's this constant battle in the mind of the maker, not to get all categorical and to get all finicky and, you know, to get all the details in there and everything, but to let it be.
Right. Well, you have
let it be the idea being worked through you and then going out to somebody else.
Right. You have to, right? Because of the detail level, right? If detail is infinite in the universe, and actually everything says it is, including physics, it's not even controversial, then you have to know where to stop. And so you're the stopping. I would reverse that. I would say the Holy Spirit's the process of creation, and the manifestation is the Son. And then that lines up with the fact that I think it was Paul in one of his recent videos a couple of days ago talking about, you know, that there's an impact, right? There's an impact to the manifestation of God on the planet in Jesus, right? So that's what spread out.
Well, but that's the work. That's the work of the So spirit is beginning and end. It's like all the other things, right? It's the bottom and the top. These all work out that way. So you've flipped it, and you've talked about the spirit at the beginning of time hovering over the surface of the waters, and that's the maker spirit aspect of the spirit. But the spirit in our time now, the spirit's work is to always point to Christ, and to always remind the believer about Christ, and to teach them all things about Christ, that they might be filled up to the fullness with Christ to overflow to others. And that's the spirit in the world, work in the world today. So when deep truths arise in the mind of the believer today, we would say that that's the work of the Holy Spirit coming to us and pointing us back to Christ.
Well,
So
sure.
theologically speaking, at least, in a very general sense.
Yeah. I mean, I could link that back and say, well, what you're really seeing in the Holy Spirit is as you're making, because we're in co-creation constantly, right? You're pointing back to the manifestation that rippled outwards from Jesus, we'll say, right? Like, because it just
because he's designated as the author and perfecter of our faith. He's designated as the architect of the universe. So, I mean, all of this terminology about him, he is the maker. Like I said,
and
they're all three members of the Trinity are both, but that's the aspect of Christ that's the maker and the
manifestation. About the three axes. Right?
Yeah.
They're both poles of all three axes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but anyway, the aspiration, if I think of aspiration as the idea, and
or the ideal,
rationality as the process by which things are thought through and designed and all of that, okay?
Rationalized.
And then relevance realization is the way that it's communicated, because that's when you see the thing and that's what it is. When you understand another person's idea. John said using realization in both meanings of the word. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I thought he meant realization is the aha moment, but realization is also making something real. Well, bringing something into reality.
Right. So he likens that back, as I recall, and I don't remember if it's in the section or not, to co-creation. Right, which is a big deal for us on the server. We talk about co-creation constantly. So in other words, there's, and this is very Neo-Platonic, right? Like there's the eidos, the realm of Plato's forms, which I like John's word eidos way better than forms. So there's the eidos, the ideals, right? The land of the ideals, and they're just kind of hanging out there, but they don't touch the material until you co-create them with speech in the world, right? And then the idea comes into being, right? And so you realize it by realizing it, right? You realize it by making it real. That was the sense I got from what he was talking about. Right?
Yeah. That was my intuition. I didn't know all that stuff you just do there, but that was my intuition when he said that.
Yeah. That's how I would couch it from John's perspective.
So let me ask you a question then about this co-creation thing, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Years ago, I used to read a lot of New Age stuff to try to recognize what it was so I could keep my daughter away from it, because a lot of it was coming into the schools. So I wanted to have some understanding of it. And even nowadays, there's a lot of this worshiping the universe and praying to the universe and having a vision board, and you believe something and it's just going to come into being. And they talk about that as co-creation. But I think co-creation is a real thing without any woo attached to it at all. When I think about one example is 6 months ago, my husband said to me, let's make a new kitchen. And so, you get the idea. Wow. So then a lot of kitchens start showing up in your mind, and then you sort of design what your ideal kitchen would be. And then you go out and find some vendors and they get some contractors, and pretty soon, 6 months later, you've got a kitchen.
Yep.
It wasn't even in your mind 7 months ago.
Right.
But it's been co-created through this whole process of people and ideas. And it's when you actually think about it, it's a very mysterious process that this reality is there now that wasn't there before. Right.
And the deep confusion that we have is we think that the beginning and end of the story is thought. Right. And so the big problem that we have is, and people do this I see it constantly, especially on social media, right? Oh, I know about that cognitive bias. Do you think that makes you immune to it? Really? I understand the psychology. Do you think that means you're not a psychological agent because you understand some form of psychology? Like, let's assume I'll give you the whole psychology. So you think once you understand psychology, you're immune to it? That's what you think. That's how you're talking about it. That's how you talk about these things. And then, again, when this goes back to these small groups, right? So you get a bunch of small groups together who say, what we're going to do? We're going to manifest no electric usage for everybody, and that will cause the earth to flourish. And from that will come the utopia, right? There's 4 of these people. There's 4 of them, right? Almost nobody thinks this, but they get together in a group and they're like, we're going to manifest this in the world. And it's like, I don't think that's how it works. I could be wrong, but so far I'm not seeing any evidence. But it's not wrong. It's just that so in my conception, and the conception that we've been using on our server, it's very much Peterson's got emanation, John's got emergence. You need both, right? And they're both not there, I think. Or maybe Peterson's there, I don't know. But John's not there. John's like struggling with emanation, but he's not like, oh, I see. And so what that means is that if you bring in real free will, you don't use some wacky definition of free will. It means I can do anything I want that I can think of at any time in any way. That's how people use free will. But you use a definition of free will is, well, free will means you have a choice between like 12 manifestations, but you can't do all 12. You can only do one. So you're going to pick between 12 things. So you have free will. It's not infinite or unlimited free will, right? So you've got to pick one of these emanations, and you have to be close enough to it to manifest something. And then the emergences happen. But if you try to make things emerge outside of the emanation, it's not going to work. And that bridges the top and the bottom for me. And I think that's how it works. Like, I think that's how it works. And then we stand in the middle. And then I had a great quote. It's in our notes file, but it's something like, so the present is the process of validating the past. That's all it is. The present doesn't even exist. The present is actually the process of validating what happened in the past, which doesn't mean it can't be rewritten or re-related to or any of that. It just means that we're not actually doing things in the present. We're solidifying what just happened, right? We're solidifying our words. Because in the present, what's happening?
Some ways we're writing a story about what happened. We're writing
exactly
stories about.
That's the validation.
Yeah.
The validation is the narrative or the story, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, and then our conception of narrative is a little bit different. So we have the archetypal, right, and then the narrative is the template, right, that points at the archetypal, and then the story is the individual instantiations. And I actually got that from a talk that John did on, I think it was the Stoa a few months ago. That was a weird week. And the guy said, oh, a story, he basically said something like a story is a template. And I was driving down the highway, I nearly like pulled off the road, and I was screaming going, no, that's wrong. I know that's wrong. And I always love these moments because I'm like, once I find something wrong, then I can reformulate it. And that's when I came up and I raced back to the house an hour and a half later, right? I get on the whiteboard and I'm like, Manuel, check this out, right? And I'm like, this is how this works. And so it's like, yes, archetype is the top thing. The narrative is the middle, is the template. And the stories, you get, 30 stories, they all point to the narrative that you should be following. And those narratives all point to the ideal, to the eidos, to the archetypal realm, right? We think that's how it's laid out. And so what that means is that the story is the intelligibility that you're creating about the past. That's what the present is, the process of weaving that story together.
We could go on for hours, but we gotta stop. But before we do, I just have to say that this is where suffering comes in.
Right, because you can't manifest the archetypal ideal. You can barely manage to stay within the narrative. And what that means is that you're necessarily failing and sinning, missing the mark in the story.
Well, that would certainly be one aspect, but that's not what I was thinking of. What I was thinking of is that the story, manifesting all the stories, those stories get rewritten when you go through suffering. And at any moment in time, this is what I think my past looked like. And so I have stories for myself of what my past looked like. And maybe my husband, I'll take my own example. 1989, my husband left me for a man. And that was the end of a 19-year marriage. And we were missionaries in Japan, and I had no choice but to come back to the United States because I had no means of support. I couldn't use the missionary support anymore. And he was my entire life. I loved him like the fabric of the universe. I mean, it was everything to me. Mm-hmm. And so so my life was completely torn apart. But my prayer at that time was, and I know this prayer was from the Holy Spirit because it wasn't from me. It couldn't possibly have come from me.
Okay.
Prayer was somehow bring joy out of this and somehow bring meaning out of this for other people, that they will not be torn apart by this. So I come back to the United States. 3 years later, I am remarried. A year after that, I have a baby. That daughter would not exist in the world if that had not happened to me at that time. So that completely rewrote that story for me. For a while, that story was, this is my tragic story of my past. Now that story is, this is the glory of my past, because this is what opened this place for me to be a mother with a new child and to have this new life, right?
Right.
I tell my story, and that's only a part of my story. There are many other things that happened in that same year. I lost both parents. I went through a lot of stuff during that year. But when I tell my story nowadays, I always say, this is my situation today. And I start with the now, because otherwise, if I start telling that story without the now in view, people can't even handle. And when you go down that hole and you start talking about all that pain, people can't handle it. They need a better story to put it into. So here's our present. It looks a certain way to us. Our past looks a certain way to us now. But whatever suffering we go through in the future, like Jordan Peterson always talks about with the movie, the ending is going to rewrite the beginning of the movie for you. It's inevitable, right?
Right. Yeah. So when you're going through a story, you have the perspective from within the story.
Yeah.
When that story is disrupted and ends, now you can look back on the story you were in and find the narrative pattern that you were in. Can't see the narrative pattern from within the implementation of the narrative pattern.
Gödel's theorem. There it is. Gödel's theorem comes up later in this video. I think
well, and yeah, there's a great video on Gödel's theorem from Veritasium, by the way. It's just wonderful. It just came out a couple months ago. But this is what Paul talks about, I think, when Paul van der Klee talks about Frodo can't see Tolkien, and yet Tolkien is everywhere. It's like, yeah. He says it all the time, and every time he says it, it's like a new revelation to me. I'm like, oh yes, right, every time, because you can't see the narrative while you're in it. You can only see the narrative when it's disrupted. And then once it's disruptive, you realize, oh, there was a story there, and that was part of this narrative, because now I have a different perspective. Yeah. Agreed.
So that's a great place to stop. I don't know. We meant to get through 30 minutes. I think we got through 17.
18 or so. Yeah, I think 18, 14 in my notes.
Okay. Well, maybe we can try to get from 18 to 45 next time, but that'll have to be next week if you have some time.
I shall try to make some time.
Okay. Sounds great, Mark. This has been super. I think it's dialogos happening all over the place.
I hope so. I hope everybody agrees. I hope they don't think we're fighting. This is lovely for me. Thank you very much for giving the time.
Fun. Did it feel like we were fighting to you at any point?
Not at all. Not at all. But who knows? These people saw the Peterson Vervaeke, and I don't know what people see anymore. I'm like, do you people inhabit the same universe? I don't know. I'm scared.
Well, maybe that's because you have a much more intimate knowledge of John. You understand.
I do think that's true. Yeah. On reflection, I realized all the nervous laughter has a different meaning to it.
I have, because I have such a deeply affectionate view towards Peterson, even though I don't agree with everything. But I've read everything he's written and watched most of his videos, and the way that I watch them is with deep respect and a deep affection. So maybe that gives me a different perspective on him too. And it's great talking to you, because I don't know that much about John's work. All I know about it is what I hear once in a while on a Paul van der Klee video, and I don't have time to watch all of his videos. So
there's a lot there.
I'm bereft.
Yeah.
Okay. Have a great week. Talk to you later.
You too. Talk soon.
Bye-bye.